Hello, everybody. This is going to be our last lecture for the semester and covering our information from Chapter 14 of your MERB text, which is on the autonomic nervous system. Okay. So the autonomic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system. Remember, we have our central nervous system, which is our brain and spinal cord. Our peripheral nervous system, let me show you on the next slide here. Our peripheral nervous system is everything else. So all of our cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and it can be divided into a sensory and a motor division. And in the motor division, we can divide into a somatic and then the autonomic. So remember, the somatic we talked about is the movement of like skeletal muscles, right? And somatic reflex arcs. This last chapter is just going to be focusing on this autonomic nervous system. Okay, so still, again, part of the peripheral nervous system. So your different nerves, your spinal nerves and cranial nerves. But yeah, just autonomic stuff. So controlling your visceral organ activity. Okay, it consists of, autonomic nervous system consists of motor neurons that innervate smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. So we've talked about this before, but everything that's not under conscious control. Okay, so basically it works to make adjustments to ensure optimal support for all of our body's activities. So it shunts blood to areas that need it. It adjusts our heart rate, blood pressure, digestive processes, all of the stuff that's just happening in your body normally that you don't think about. Your respiratory rate, your blood pressure, your all of that internal workings, your autonomic nervous system controls, okay? And it's doing that, again, subconsciously. Think autonomic, automatic. Well, this says automatic nervous system. Let's just say autonomic. It's actually called the autonomic, okay? But you can think automatic, okay? Also known as involuntary nervous system, or your general visceral motor system. Okay, again, visceral is a control of those visceral organs, heart, digestive organs, etc. Okay. All right, so we've talked a little bit again about the somatic nervous system, and this we're going to be talking about is the autonomic nervous system. So what's the differences and similarities between them? Okay, so I want to first talk about the differences. And this should be pretty straightforward, but effectors. Your somatic nervous system innervates your skeletal muscles, right? Things you consciously control the movement of. Autonomic innervates cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, right? Things that we're not controlling. Next big difference is in the efferent pathways and ganglia. So in our somatic nervous system, the cell body is in the central nervous system. And you have a single thick myelinated axon that extends in the spinal or cranial nerves directly to the skeletal muscle. Okay, so in the somatic nervous system, you have the cell body of your motor neuron. And this is talking about your motor neurons. Cell body directly in the central nervous system. Axon goes all the way out, innervates the skeletal muscle. Okay. In the autonomic nervous system, instead of just one motor neuron, you have a 2-neuron chain. Okay, so we have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron is going to be the one that originates in the central nervous system, and the axon will extend to innervate the second neuron. The second neuron is the postganglionic neuron. That's going to originate in the peripheral nervous system, and the axon will then extend to the target tissue from there. Okay, so somatic nervous system, 1 motor neuron. Autonomic nervous system, you have 2 motor neurons. And then the last big group of differences are the target organ responses to the neurotransmitter. In the somatic nervous system, all of our motor neurons release acetylcholine. We've talked about that before, remember, at the neuromuscular junction. You have acetylcholinesterase breaking down acetylcholine after it's used. The effect is always going to be stimulatory. Acetylcholine binds, it's going to depolarize your motor end plate, make it more likely for that muscle to contract, right? Stimulate. Our autonomic nervous system, preganglionic fibers release acetylcholine. Postganglionic fibers, though, sometimes release norepinephrine and sometimes release acetylcholine. Okay, so the effect can be stimulatory or inhibitory depending on the type of receptors. Okay, so somatic nervous system, always stimulatory, always acetylcholine. Autonomic, we can have some acetylcholine, we have some norepinephrine, and we can have stimulatory or inhibitory depending on the type of receptor. Okay. So those are the main differences between the somatic nervous system and autonomic. But there are some similarities. Obviously, higher brain centers regulate and coordinate both of these systems, somatic and autonomic. We talked about this in the last chapter, but most spinal and many cranial nerves contain both somatic and autonomic fibers, right? Which is what leads to referred pain, this kind of crossover between somatic or visceral fibers. So nerves will carry both types of information. And adaptations usually involve both skeletal muscles and our visceral organs. So, for example, active muscles require more oxygen and glucose. So the autonomic nervous system speeds up the heart rate and opens the airways more to provide more oxygen and more glucose to the muscles. Okay, so although the motor functions are going to be different, everything's kind of working towards the same cause. There's going to be a lot of overlap between the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. The autonomic nervous system is going to function really to help out the needs of the somatic nervous system so that our body can do what it needs to do to get the energy and oxygen that it needs. Okay. So here's kind of an image showing the main differences. Again, somatic, we always have acetylcholine. We're going to be skeletal muscles. Effects are always stimulatory. We have a single neuron from the CNS to our effector organs. Our autonomic nervous system, we talked about we can have neurons releasing norepinephrine or acetylcholine, stimulatory or inhibitory depending on the neurotransmitter, depending on the receptor. It could be smooth muscle, glands, cardiac muscle, right? And we're always going to have a 2-neuron chain in our autonomic nervous system. Okay, a preganglionic axon. So our preganglionic axons would be these guys, preganglionic, preganglionic, preganglionic. And you see those are releasing our acetylcholine always. However, our postganglionic axon, postganglionic, this second example, we're synapsing onto a gland right away. But our postganglionic can have norepinephrine or acetylcholine. Okay, and it's going to depend on what division of our autonomic nervous system we're in. So we have our sympathetic division and our parasympathetic division. Okay, so these two divisions control. They innervate everything. There's a few organs and stuff that don't have overlap, but most organs will be innervated by both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers, and they have different effects on our organs. Okay, so our parasympathetic division promotes the maintenance functions and conserves our energy. Sympathetic is the opposite. It mobilizes the body during activity. So you'll hear the parasympathetic divisions called rest and digest, right? So just maintenance function, getting our energy back, resting our body, resting our tissues, so on and so forth. Our sympathetic is known as our fight or flight. Okay, it's going to stop these just normal maintenance functions, so we're not using energy to digest food, and get our body ready to fight, run away, do the things that it needs to do to get out of a dangerous or extreme situation. Okay. Our body has what's called dual innervation, which all visceral organs are served by both divisions. But the divisions, like I said, are going to have opposite effects. Okay. And this is a dynamic antagonism between the two divisions that maintain homeostasis. So at some points, we want to increase our heart rate. If our heart rate gets too high, we want to decrease our heart rate. Okay. So these two divisions kind of work together and make sure that our body stays at this nice homeostatic balance, hopefully, unless we have something a little skewed. But make sure that we're staying within our homeostatic balance for blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, different levels of oxygen, glucose, whatever it may be in our blood. Okay. So here's an image showing our two divisions. Again, you're going to see that everything kind of innervates everything. So parasympathetic, you see eye, salivary gland, heart, lungs, stomach, pancreas, liver, gallbladder, bladder, genitals. And then the same stuff over here. Eye, skin also for sympathetic. Salivary glands, lung, heart, stomach, pancreas, liver, gallbladder, adrenal, bladder, genitals. Okay. And we can see the differences here that we have already talked about. Well, for our autonomic nervous system, we're going to have two neuron motor chains, right? Preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. In our parasympathetic nervous system, our preganglionic fibers are going to be long. So you can see these preganglionic fibers are very long. Our postganglionic fibers are going to be very short. Right, so if I zoom in right here, this is supposed to be like our postganglionic fiber, right? Really short fiber. And our ganglia, where these preganglionic and postganglionic meet, are within or really close to our effector organs. Okay, so if we're trying to innervate our stomach, our ganglia would be in the stomach. Okay, whereas our sympathetic, we have short preganglionic fibers, long postganglionic fibers, which means our ganglia are going to be closer to the spinal cord. Okay, so if I go here, our preganglionic fiber, right, and our ganglia is close to the spinal cord, and our postganglionic fiber then is going to be much longer in our sympathetic division compared to our parasympathetic. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the differences between the two. So parasympathetic, like I said, is rest and digest, where sympathetic is fight and flight. Okay, and I remember parasympathetic is rest and digest because I think if you're like slowing stuff down, I think paralyzed. And when you're paralyzed, you can't move, so you can't fight or flight. So you're just sitting there resting, digesting. So that's how I remember. But the parasympathetic keeps body energy use as low as possible. So it's just carrying out these maintenance activities, but not using very much energy. So really allowing your body to rest. Directs or increases, let's say, digestion, diuresis, and defecation. Again, known as rest and digest. So a person relaxing and reading after a meal. So the body is going to work to rest its tissues and digest that food. So blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rates are low, right? Because our body doesn't need extra oxygen or extra blood flow to our tissues because we're just sitting there resting. Activity in the GI tract where our food is digesting is high because we're trying to digest that food. Pupils constricted, lenses accommodated for close visions. We're rested, just relax and vibing, right? Our sympathetic division is the opposite. So we're trying to mobilize our body during activity. So things such as exercise, excitement, emergencies, embarrassment, anxieties can activate our sympathetic system. So we have the opposite of this stuff. So increased heart rate, dry mouth, because we're not trying to digest, so we don't need our salivary amylase. Cold, sweaty skin, dilated pupils, so we can get as much light in, so we can see as best as we can, right? Evolutionarily, if we would need this system so that if we had a predator coming up and trying to kill us, we could fight him or run away. So we want to be able to see the best, which is why our pupils dilate. We're not worried about digesting and maintaining nutrients and stuff. We're using up our energy, increasing our heart rate, getting blood pumping to our tissues so we have oxygen and glucose, everything that our tissues need to be able to run away and fight off the bear, okay? During vigorous physical activity, it shunts blood to skeletal muscles and the heart, places that, need it. Dilates our bronchioles so we can take up oxygen more easily, and causes liver to release glucose so that we have the energy that our cells need to function. Okay. 3 main differences between these two divisions. The sites or origins. Parasympathetic fibers are craniosacral. So they originate in the brain, cranial, right? And then the sacral part of the spinal cord. Sympathetic fibers are thoracolumbar. They originate in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this guy here, right? Parasympathetic, craniosacral. Okay, you see the fibers are all originating in that area. Sympathetic, thoracolumbar, we have fibers coming from our thoracic and our lumbar regions. Okay, so that's the difference in the names there. Relative length of fibers I already talked about. Parasympathetic has long preganglionic, short postganglionic. Sympathetic has short preganglionic and long postganglionic fibers. And then the third thing I've already talked about as well is the location of ganglia. So our parasympathetic ganglia are located in or near their effector organ. Sympathetic is closer to the spinal cord, okay, which makes sense because our postganglionic axons are going to be longer. Okay, so here's just some different characteristics, basically what I just said, but I'm just kind of summarizing everything for you. So you have it on your PowerPoint. All right, and then a few more just slides talking about more specific on these things. So parasympathetic, again, also called craniosacral division. Fibers originate from the brain and the sacral area of the spinal cord. We have long preganglionic fibers. Okay, they almost go all the way to the extended target organs. They synapse with postganglionic neurons in the terminal ganglia. Terminal ganglia because the ganglia are very close or within their target organs. Okay, which means we have very short postganglionic fibers. Okay. So here's just another thing showing where these parasympathetic fibers are innervating. Craniosacral division. Okay. And then our sympathetic fibers are going to be a little bit more complex. And they're going to also innervate more organs than our parasympathetic. Okay, so things like sweat glands, our erector pili muscles of the hair follicle, and our smooth muscles of blood vessels are only innervated by sympathetic fibers. Okay, most everything else is going to be, again, innervated by both. Also known as your thoracolumbar, because you have the axons coming from the thoracic and lumbar regions. And again, we're going to have short preganglionic neurons, long postganglionic neurons, and the ganglia closer to the spinal cord than our parasympathetic. Okay, so here's the same thing, kind of showing where all this stuff is happening, innervation. Kind of cool to look at all this. Okay. Our visceral sensory neurons are sending information about our chemical changes, stretch, temperature, irritation of viscera to the brain. Receptors for visceral senses are typically free nerve endings and are going to be widely scattered throughout the viscera. Cell bodies are located in the dorsal root ganglion. and in sensory ganglia of cranial nerves. So we've already talked about that. And we've already talked about this as well, but axons are traveling in the same nerves as autonomic motor fibers. So for example, your parasympathetic fibers of the vagus nerve is going to be traveling in the same nerves as they monitor conditions or organs serviced by the ANS nerves. Okay. We talked about reflex arcs in the previous chapter. And those we really talked about somatic reflex arcs. I did mention that you can have visceral reflex arcs as well. And they're going to have the same components as your somatic reflex arcs. You have your receptor, sensory neuron, integration center, motor neuron, and your effector. But there are some differences. Okay, 3 main differences. Visceral reflex arc has 2 consecutive neurons in the motor pathway. So if you look here, our motor neuron chain, we've talked about it before, but you have a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron, right? So you're going to have our preganglionic neuron, here's our ganglion, and then the postganglionic neuron that synapses onto the effector. Okay. Afferent fibers are going to be the visceral sensory neurons that we talked about on this last slide. And effectors are going to be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, which, again, obviously we're talking visceral here, not somatic, so that's kind of, you should already know that. So some examples of visceral reflex arcs are like the reflexes that empty your rectum and bladder, so involved in defecation, urination. Okay, so moving on, we started talking a little bit about how there's some differences in neurotransmitters. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about that. So in the autonomic nervous system, we have acetylcholine and norepinephrine as our neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine is released by what we call cholinergic fibers in all ANS preganglionic axons and all parasympathetic postganglionic axons. Okay. Norepinephrine is released by adrenergic fibers at almost all sympathetic postganglionic axons, except at sweat glands, which acetylcholine is released. So acetylcholine is all right? Pre, and then para, post, and norepinephrine is sympathetic, postganglionic. Okay. The effects of the neurotransmitter depends on what receptor it's binding to. So cholinergic receptors or adrenergic receptors. So there's 2 types of cholinergic receptors that bind acetylcholine. We have nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. And they're named after drugs that bind to them and mimic acetylcholine. So we haven't really talked about it too much, but you have drugs work by being agonists a lot of the times or antagonists and kind of mimicking the effect of some different chemicals or neurotransmitters. So for example, nicotine is able to bind to this nicotinic receptor, and nicotine kind of mimics acetylcholine at the nicotinic receptor and activates it. And then muscarine is what muscarinic receptors are named after, and it's a mushroom poison. Okay, so a little bit more on both of those. So nicotinic receptors, again, this is for acetylcholine, so cholinergic. They're in all postganglionic neurons, both sympathetic and parasympathetic. They're found on hormone-producing cells of the adrenal medulla, as well as the sarcolemma of skeletal muscles at the neuromuscular junction. So when we talked about the neuromuscular junctions of muscle physiology, we were talking about nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. Okay, and back then we didn't talk about different types of neurotransmitters, so we didn't talk too much about it, but they are nicotinic. And effects of the nicotinic receptors are always going to be stimulatory. So same thing that we talked about that's happening at the neuromuscular junction. When we have acetylcholine binding to these receptors, right? If acetylcholine is released from the presynaptic neuron, binds to the acetylcholine receptors. Say this is at the neuromuscular junction. Acetylcholine binding will cause this channel to open, cause sodium to go into the channel, which will lead to a depolarization. Okay? Which is stimulating the cell. Okay? So this, like I said, for this example, we talked about on the neuromuscular junction, but this is also on other neurons. So the postganglionic neurons, right? We're going to see the preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. Okay. So then the postganglionic neurons, obviously you're going to have receptors for acetylcholine, so that the acetylcholine being released from this preganglionic neuron can activate this postganglionic neuron. Okay, so this happens, in the neuromuscular junction, the motor end plate, but also within other neurons and stuff as well. Muscarinic receptors, again, acetylcholine, cholinergic receptors, are found on all effector cells stimulated by postganglionic cholinergic fibers. And muscarinic receptors can either be excitatory or inhibitory. Okay. It depends on the receptor type of the target organ, which gets a little bit advanced for us. But for example, if you bind acetylcholine to cardiac muscle cells, it will slow the heart rate. But if you bind it to intestinal smooth muscle cells, it increases motility. Okay, so it depends on our target organ. It can be excitatory, can be inhibitory, but yeah. Okay, so that's our acetylcholine receptors. We have two classes of receptors also that respond to norepinephrine or epinephrine, which is like adrenaline and noradrenaline, same thing. I'm not going to ask you specifics on these, but we have alpha receptors and beta receptors that have subclasses. You have alpha 1, 2, beta 1, 2, 3. Okay. And again, the effect of norepinephrine is going to depend on which subclass of receptor predominates a target organ. So you might see all of these receptors present on a target organ. That's probably very common. But there's going to be one receptor that's going to dominate an area. Okay. And the results of the norepinephrine will depend on which class of receptor is present. So for example, on cardiac muscles, you have beta 1 receptors, which increases heart rate. Epinephrine causes bronchial relaxation when bound to beta 2 receptors. So it's just, depending on where you're at, it's going to have different effects. Okay. Like I said, most visceral organs are going to have what we call that dual innervation. So we have innervation from both parasympathetic and sympathetic nerve fibers. Okay. Action potentials are going to be firing down both axons of both of the divisions, producing this antagonistic interaction. So we're controlling the activity by increasing heart rate or decreasing the heart rate, kind of having both sympathetic and parasympathetic effects to make sure that we maintain that homeostasis. Okay. We have what we know as a parasympathetic and sympathetic tone, which is a result of the ANS divisions that are always a little bit active. Okay, which results in, it's called a basal, kind of like a baseline tone of parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. So these divisions are always working. They're not going to ever shut off, right? Because it's controlling our smooth muscles. So you're always going to have them on to make sure that our heart's beating, make sure our smooth muscles are working and digesting. But the amounts of each kind of sympathetic or parasympathetic activation is going to change the rates of these different things. Okay, one division is going to usually predominate, but in a few cases, divisions are going to have a cooperative effect. So they kind of have to work together in order to get a cooperative effect to happen. Okay, so for antagonistic interactions, this allows for precise control over visceral activity. So again, we're all going to have like a baseline tone rate of activity for all these to keep our heart pumping, our blood moving, all that stuff. But this antagonistic interaction is one's going to increase more than the other to kind of control the rate that stuff's happening. So for example, sympathetic division increases heart and respiratory rates and inhibits digestion and elimination. And parasympathetic is going to do the opposite. So it's going to decrease heart and respiratory rates and allow for digestion and discarding of wastes. So depending on what our body needs or thinks it needs, it's going to activate one of these two divisions a little bit more than the other. Okay. So like I said, though, these divisions are always going to be a little bit active, giving us what's called this tone. So we have sympathetic tone, which is that continual state of partial constriction of blood vessels. Okay, so sympathetic tone is going to be really important in this blood vessel constriction specifically, which is this is the main example you're going to see here. So sympathetic tone we also will call our vasomotor tone. So it's this continual state of partial constriction of our blood vessels, so they're never going to fully relax. If our blood pressure drops, sympathetic fibers fire faster than normal to increase constriction of blood vessels and cause the blood pressure to rise. Right? If blood pressure rises, sympathetic fibers are going to fire a little bit less than normal, causing less constriction, which leads to a decrease in blood pressure. Okay, so again, it's going to depend on the situation, our body, how our body's reacting, if we're in a mode where we're frightened or we're just relaxing. We have the different sympathetic innervation, just again, depending on what our body needs. And this control over the blood vessels is really important because it allows the sympathetic division to control where blood's going to. It allows it to specifically increase or decrease blood pressures in different areas to help move blood to areas of our body that may need it more. Okay. The parasympathetic division normally dominates our heart and smooth muscle of digestive and urinary tract organs and activates most glands except for our adrenal and sweat. Typically is going to slow the heart rate and dictate normal activities, so normal levels of digestive and urinary activity. So these organs also have a parasympathetic tone in this case, where they're always going to be slightly activated. Okay, for sympathetic tone, we're going to see that more in the blood vessels. Parasympathetic tone, you're going to see in the heart, the smooth muscle of our digestive glands, our digestive tract, urinary organs, and then those other glands as well. Okay, so you want them to be always a little bit active, but again, depending on the situation, we can either increase heart rate, decrease heart rate even more, increase digestion, decrease it, yada, yada, yada. During times of stress, our sympathetic division is going to override this parasympathetic division and kind of take over, right? So a parasympathetic keeps our heart rate kind of low, keeps digestive going. If our parasympathetic division, if our sympathetic division takes over, we're going to increase our heart rate and decrease digestion. Okay, so these are going to kind of work together back and forth to cooperate. Okay, there's some areas of our body where you need cooperation to control the organs to produce an effect that you want. So the best example of this is the control of the external genitalia. Okay, normally you're going to have one division, either sympathetic or parasympathetic, dominating, right? Depending on if you're stressed or relaxed. But for our external genitalia, you need cooperation between both divisions simultaneously for proper functioning to happen. So, for example, our parasympathetic fibers cause vasodilation. Vasodilation increases the diameter of the blood vessels, which allows more blood to flow to the area, which is responsible for the erection of the penis or clitoris. Okay, so we need that for an erection or our clitoris to become more sensitized. But sympathetic fibers are also activated, and these are what's going to be causing ejaculation of semen in males, and then the reflex contraction of a female's vagina. Okay, so you need the parasympathetic fibers activated, but you also need the sympathetic fibers activated. Okay, so this is a really good example of cooperation. Both of these systems working at the same time to achieve a desired effect. Okay. Our sympathetic division specifically has some unique roles. Our sympathetic division only is going to be innervating the adrenal medulla, sweat glands, erector pili muscles, kidneys, and almost all of our blood vessels are only receiving parasympathetic fibers. Okay, so they have full control over these parts of our body. Our sympathetic division also is in charge of the thermoregulation responses to heat. So our blood vessels, obviously for our blood vessels, if body temperature rises, we will dilate blood vessels, allowing heat to escape and activate sweat glands. If our body temperatures drop, blood vessels constrict. Release of renin from kidneys is unique to the sympathetic division. So it causes the release of renin that activates a system that increases blood pressure. And then also some metabolic effects are unique to the sympathetic division. So it increases the metabolic rate of cells, raises blood glucose level, and some mobilizes some fats for use as fuels. Okay. Parasympathetic division tends to elicit more short-lived and highly localized control over effectors. And this is in part due to its use of acetylcholine, which is quickly destroyed by acetylcholinesterase, which is that enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. Our sympathetic division is more longer-lasting effects and body-wide. Okay, so it's going to be happening all over. Okay. Norepinephrine is inactivated more slowly than acetylcholine. And norepinephrine and epinephrine are hormones that are released from the adrenal medulla. And they have prolonged effects that last even after the sympathetic signals stop. So because we're using norepinephrine and epinephrine, that gets into the bloodstream and has body-wide effects all over and takes a while to get out of the blood, which is why if you're in a stressful situation for a little while afterwards, you still might feel stressed out. Your heart might continue to beat kind of fast because you still have that epinephrine or adrenaline rushing through the blood. Okay. So here's a list of the different effects of the parasympathetic compared to the sympathetic on different organs. So for our eye, the iris of our eye, parasympathetic, we're constricting the pupils. Sympathetic, we dilate the pupils. So opposite effects, right? If we're trying to fight or flight, we're dilating the pupils so that we can get more light and we can see better. For example, salivary glands, parasympathetic is stimulating of it. Watery saliva, so we have our salivary amylase to help digestion. Sympathetic effects is a more thick, viscous saliva that doesn't have those enzymes that digest the food. Parasympathetic, decreased heart rate. Sympathetic, increased heart rate. So go through these and take a look. Make sure you can kind of know the difference between here and the parasympathetic and sympathetic effects of all these organs. Okay. And then the last bit I want to talk about is some autonomic neuropathy or damage. Damage to the autonomic nerves is a common complication of diabetes mellitus. Okay. Early signs of this include some sexual dysfunctions, other symptoms, dizziness after standing suddenly, which can be due to other things as well. It doesn't have to be this, but if it's autonomic neuropathy, it's due to poor blood pressure control, urinary incontinence, sluggish eye pupil reactions, and impaired sweating. The best way to prevent diabetic neuropathy is to maintain good blood glucose levels. So with diabetes, if we don't have proper blood glucose levels, it can really mess with our autonomic functioning in our body. Okay. The autonomic nervous system is under control of the central nervous system centers. So in our brainstem, spinal cord, hypothalamus, and cerebral cortex. Hypothalamus is generally the main integrative center of autonomic nervous system activity. Okay. Cerebral input may modify the autonomic nervous system, but it does it subconsciously. So you're not consciously thinking about increasing your heart rate or whatever. It's going to be subconscious control from your cerebral cortex. And again, mostly it's going to be working through these hypothalamic centers, but also some limbic system centers as well. So our cerebral cortex frontal lobe can play a role if we're thinking about how stressed out we are. That can activate our sympathetic nervous system, or we're embarrassed, we do something silly and our sympathetic nervous system is activated, which also is kind of goes with this limbic system emotional input. Feeling scared, feeling nervous, feeling anxious, that can activate our autonomic nervous system. But overall, the hypothalamus is the boss, the major integration of the autonomic nervous system. Areas in our brainstem in the reticular formation have more control over something, such as pupil size, heart rate, blood pressure, airflow, salivation. And then the spinal cord has some reflexes for things like urination, defecation, erection, and ejaculation. Okay. And then lastly, some other autonomic nervous system disorders. They're all going to have some sort of issue with smooth controlling of smooth muscle. So hypertension is an example, which is high blood pressure. You have overactive sympathetic vasoconstrictor responses to stress. So you're stressed out, your blood vessels are going to constrict, which will increase your blood pressure, but it does so too much, right? So it has bad control. So this is not good, obviously, because it makes it so your heart has to work harder. Heart must work harder, and your artery walls are subject to increased wear and tear because there's greater pressure exerted on them. It can be treated with adrenic receptor blocking drugs to help stop those sympathetic nervous system neurons from firing. Raynaud's disease is painful, exaggerated vasoconstriction in your fingers and toes. So you're going to see your fingers or toes, your digits, turn very pale. And again, it's a lack of control over these smooth muscles. Okay, and it's going to be treated with vasodilators. And the last type of disorder here, autonomic dysreflexia. It's a very life-threatening, uncontrolled activation of autonomic neurons in quadriplegics and people who have spinal cord injuries above the thoracic 6. It causes blood pressure to skyrocket, which posed an increased risk for stroke. Okay, so anytime you have autonomic nervous system disorders, smooth muscle activity is the main thing that you're going to see is affected. Okay. All right. That is it for our chapter 14 lecture. If you have any questions, let me know.